Frank Morrison woke up at 4 in the morning from a familiar nightmare. The jungles of Vietnam, the cries of his comrades, the smell of napalm. 58 years had passed, but the war still haunted him. He sat on the edge of the bed, breathing heavily, and looked at Agatha sleeping beside him. Her dark hair was scattered across the pillow, her face looking peaceful in the morning twilight. In 3 months, she would become his wife. Frank got up and quietly made his way to the kitchen of his small house on the outskirts of Fairbanks. Outside the window, a February blizzard raged, snow sticking to the windows. He turned on the coffee maker and took out his cigarettes, an old habit that even Agatha, with all her persuasion, had been unable to eradicate. At 7 in the morning, Agatha joined him, already dressed in a strict business suit. 32 years old, she was the manager of the Northern Lights Hotel, the only decent place to stay in their town. Smart and determined, she had come to Fairbanks 5 years ago from Anchorage, fleeing an unhappy marriage. "Nightmares again?" she asked, pouring herself some coffee. Frank nodded without looking up. "It'll pass. Maybe you should talk to Dr. Henderson. He's helped a lot of veterans." "I don't need doctors," Frank replied sharply. "I've been managing on my own for 40 years. Agatha sat down next to him at the small kitchen table. "Frank, we need to discuss the wedding. I booked a room at the hotel for May 15th. Bouquets, decorations, everything as we planned." Frank looked at the wedding ring on her finger, a simple gold band that he could barely afford on his salary as a salesman at Northern Tools hardware store. Agatha deserved better, but for some reason, she had chosen him. "What about Andrew? Has he agreed to be the best man?" she asked cautiously. Frank's face darkened. "I don't know. We haven't talked. Frank, he's your son, your only son. He's a grown man of 28. If he wants to come to his father's wedding, he'll come." His relationship with Andrew was a painful subject. After his divorce from his first wife, Linda, 15 years ago, Frank had seen his son only sporadically. The boy blamed his father for destroying the family, and Frank couldn't explain how the war had changed him, how he had become a different person after returning from Vietnam. Agatha went to the hotel, and Frank went to work. The hardware store was located in the city center, an old brick building that remembered the days of the gold rush. Its owner, Bill Harris, was a patient man who didn't ask unnecessary questions about his employees' pasts. At 10:30, Andrew walked into the store. Tall and broad-shouldered, he worked for Alaska Construction and often bought tools and materials there. Frank felt awkward every time he saw his son. He recognized himself in Andrew's features when he was young, but he saw alienation in his eyes. "Hi, Dad," Andrew said, approaching the nail rack. "Andrew." Frank nodded. "How's the construction site?" "Fine. We're finishing up a residential complex on East Street." Andrew paused, then added, "I heard you're getting married." "Yes, May 15th. Agatha is a good woman." Frank looked at his son more closely. "Do you know her?" "Fairbanks is a small town, Dad. Everyone knows everyone." Andrew picked up the bag of nails. "I have to go." "Andrew, wait." Frank took a step forward. "Agatha would like you to be the best man, and so would I." His son stopped at the door. "I'll think about it." After Andrew left, Frank felt empty. Why was it so difficult to talk to his own son? Why did every conversation turn into a minefield? That evening, he met Stephen Bradley at the North Star Bar. Stephen, his best friend since their days in Vietnam, understood him better than anyone else. A short, stocky man of 52, he had owned the bar for 10 years and was the unofficial psychologist for the local veterans. "How are the wedding preparations going?" Stephen asked, pouring Frank a whiskey. "Agatha is organizing everything. I feel like I'm walking on eggshells." "Andrew? He doesn't want to be the best man. I understand him, to be honest." Stephen twirled the glass thoughtfully in his hands. "You know, Frank, maybe it's time to stop blaming yourself for the past. Andrew's a grown man. If he's not ready to forgive, that's his choice." "I ruined his childhood, Steve. Drunkenness, angry outbursts, nightmares. Linda was right to leave me. You were sick, buddy. PTSD is an illness. That's no excuse. Returning home around 10 o'clock that evening, Frank found Agatha busy planning the wedding. The table was covered with catalogs, guest lists, fabric samples. She looked tired but happy. "How was your day?" she asked, without looking up from her notebook. "Andrew stopped by the store, said he'd think about being the best man." Agatha finally looked at him. "That's progress." "Maybe." Frank sat down next to her. "Agatha, are you sure you want to tie your life to an old, broken veteran?" She took his hand in hers. "Frank Morrison, you're not broken. You're a survivor, and I love you just the way you are." That night, Frank lay awake for a long time, listening to Agatha's breathing. The wind howled outside the window, and somewhere deep inside, he felt a restlessness he couldn't explain. 2 weeks had passed since that February morning. Agatha stood at the window of her office at the Northern Lights Hotel, watching Andrew unload building materials near the main entrance. Her heart pounded wildly every time she saw him. It had started 3 months ago, long before her engagement to Frank, but now the situation was becoming unbearable. The phone on the desk rang, interrupting her thoughts. Northern Lights Hotel, Agatha speaking. "Hi, it's Andrew. I need to talk to you about ordering materials for the lobby renovation." Agatha swallowed. They both knew that no renovation was planned. "Sure. Come to my office in 15 minutes. She hung up the phone with trembling hands. How had it come to this? How could she have fallen in love with her fiancé's son? Andrew appeared exactly 15 minutes later, knocking on the office door. He looked tense, his usually confident movements seeming stiff. "Close the door," Agatha said quietly. He obeyed and turned to face her. The whole room was between them, but the tension was palpable. "Agatha, this has to stop," he said, not approaching her. "You're marrying my father in 3 months." "You think I don't know?" Her voice sounded sharper than she had intended. "You think I don't suffer every day? Then why did you call me here?" Agatha approached him, stopping a few inches away. "Because I can't stop thinking about you. Because when I wake up next to your father, I imagine you." Andrew closed his eyes. "Agatha, I know it's wrong. I know we're hurting Frank, but I can't stop." He opened his eyes and looked at her. His gaze held the same pain, the same desire. "How did this start? How did we get to this point?" Agatha turned away toward the window. "Remember that night in October? Frank was in the hospital after a panic attack, and you came to visit him. We talked in the hallway." "I remember. You told me about your childhood, how difficult it was growing up with a veteran father. I realized we were alike, both trying to heal old wounds." Andrew came up behind her, but didn't touch her. "And then there was that meeting at Stephen's bar, when Frank went to the bathroom and we were left alone. You said you understood why I chose him, that I saw in him the man he was before the war. And you replied that you saw in him the man he could have been if the war hadn't broken him." They were silent for a few minutes. Outside the window, the workers continued to unload the truck. "You kissed me for the first time in November," Agatha whispered. "It was a mistake." "Then why did you come back the next day?" Andrew turned her toward him. "Because I can't think of anything else. Because I fell in love with my father's fiancée, and it's tearing me apart." Their lips met in a desperate kiss. All the months of pent-up emotion burst forth. Agatha clung to him like a lifeline, and Andrew held her as if afraid she would disappear. When they broke the kiss, they were both breathing heavily. "We can't keep doing this," Andrew said, but his hands were still on her waist. "I know. If my father finds out, he won't. Agatha, he's a veteran with PTSD. If he finds out his fiancée is cheating on him with his own son, it could kill him." Agatha pulled away. "You think I don't think about that? Every night I go to bed next to him and feel like a traitor." then call off the wedding. And say what? That I fell in love with his son? That will ruin your relationship forever. Our relationship is already ruined. You know our history. Agatha sat down in a chair at the table. Tell me again about what happened when you were a child. Andrew leaned against the wall. My father came back from Vietnam when I was 5. For the first few years, he tried to be a normal father, but the war was still inside him. Nightmares, drinking, fits of rage. My mother tried to save him, but in the end, it destroyed her. And you blamed him. I was a kid. I didn't understand what PTSD was. All I saw was my father yelling at my mother, coming home drunk, sometimes looking at me as if he didn't recognize me. But now you understand. Now I understand that he's sick. But that doesn't erase the memories. It doesn't erase how my mother cried at night. There was a knock at the door. Agatha and Andrew froze. Agatha? It's Susan from reception. Mr. Morrison is here to see you. Agatha felt the blood drain from her face. Which Morrison? Frank, your fiancé. Andrew quickly moved to the window, pretending to examine the construction work. Agatha fixed her hair and opened the door. Susan, tell Frank I'll be right with him after I finish this business meeting. When Susan left, Agatha closed the door and turned to Andrew. He's here. I heard. What should we do? Andrew walked to the door. I'll leave through the service exit. Wait 5 minutes, then go to him. Andrew. He stopped without turning around. What? When will I see you again? I don't know. Maybe never. Don't say that. He turned to her. In his eyes, she saw the same pain she felt herself. Agatha, we're playing with fire. Sooner or later, we're going to get burned. After he left, Agatha took a few minutes to compose herself. Then she went out to the lobby, where Frank was standing at the reception desk, talking to Susan. Hi, honey, she said as she approached him. What brings you here? Frank smiled and kissed her on the cheek. I'm on my lunch break. I thought maybe we could have lunch together. Sure. Agatha took his arm, trying to look natural. How's the store? Same as usual. By the way, I saw Andrew's construction company truck in the parking lot. Is he working here? Agatha's heart skipped a beat. Yes, they're doing some minor repairs. Nothing serious. Too bad I didn't meet him. Maybe we could have talked. He's probably already left, Agatha said quickly. They went to the hotel restaurant. Over lunch, Frank talked about work, wedding plans, and inviting a few more friends from the store. Agatha nodded and smiled, but her thoughts were far away. You look tired, Frank remarked. Maybe you should take a day off? Just a lot of work, preparing for the tourist season. Agatha, I want you to know that I appreciate everything you do. The wedding, your support, your patience with my problems. Guilt overwhelmed her. Frank, no, let me speak. I know I'm not the perfect man. The war left its mark, but you make me better. Agatha took his hand. You're a good man, Frank. Sometimes I'm afraid you'll realize your mistake and run away. That won't happen. Liar, she thought. I'm already running. I just don't know where. That evening, Andrew sat in his apartment with an empty beer bottle in his hand. He took off his work boots and tried to focus on the TV, but his thoughts kept returning to Agatha. How could he have fallen in love with his own father's fiancée? How could he betray the person who, despite all their problems, was still his family? The phone rang. Agatha's name appeared on the screen. Hello? Andrew, it's me. Don't hang up. Agatha, we agreed. I can't pretend that nothing is happening. What do you suggest? Tell my father the truth at the wedding rehearsal? I don't know. Maybe we could meet again. Talk. Talk? Andrew laughed bitterly. We both know it won't end with talking. Andrew, please. He closed his eyes. Every word she spoke was like a knife to his heart. Where? There's an old sawmill on the outskirts of town. Tomorrow at 7 in the evening. Agatha, I'll be there. It's up to you. She hung up. Andrew stared at the phone for a few more minutes, knowing that tomorrow he would go to the meeting, knowing that with each passing day, they were getting deeper and deeper into this lie. On the other side of town, Frank lay in bed next to the sleeping Agatha. Something about her behavior today had seemed strange to him. Tension, distraction. Maybe the wedding preparations were harder for her than she was letting on. He turned on his side and looked at her face in the moonlight. Agatha was the best thing that had happened to him in many years. He couldn't lose her. He couldn't be alone with his demons again. March brought the first signs of spring to Fairbanks, but the frosts still lingered. Frank stood at the window of the hardware store, watching Andrew load lumber into his pickup truck across the street. It was strange to see his son in town so often lately. Usually, the construction company bought materials in bulk from large suppliers. "Your boy's been here a lot," Bill Harris remarked, approaching Frank with a mug of coffee. "I've noticed. Maybe he wants to mend fences before your wedding?" Frank shrugged, but something inside him was unsettled. He had seen Andrew in town more often in the last month than in the previous year, and every time they ran into each other, his son seemed tense and avoided eye contact. During his lunch break, Frank decided to stop by Agatha's hotel. He had done so often in recent weeks, but today, something made him especially cautious. Instead of going through the main entrance, he headed for the service entrance on the parking lot side. What he saw made him freeze around the corner of the building. Andrew and Agatha were standing near the service entrance. They weren't touching each other, but the distance between them was minimal. Agatha was saying something, her face tense, and Andrew was looking at her with an expression Frank had never seen on his son's face before. Tenderness? Pain? The conversation lasted no more than a minute. Andrew looked around, as if checking to see if anyone was watching them, then quickly got into his car and drove away. Agatha stood there for a few more seconds, watching him go, then returned to the building. Frank stood around the corner, feeling cold sweat beading on his forehead. What was that? A business meeting? But then why did they meet at the service entrance instead of the office? And why was Andrew looking around so much? He waited a few minutes, then entered the hotel through the main entrance. "Mr. Morrison," Susan greeted him cheerfully. "Agatha is in her office. Would you like me to call her?" "No need. I'll go in myself." Frank went up to the second floor and knocked on Agatha's office door. When he entered, she was sitting at her desk, but she looked agitated. "Frank, how nice to see you." She stood up to kiss him, but the kiss seemed hurried, mechanical. "How are you? You look tired." "A lot of work. You know how it is in March, preparing for the summer season." Frank sat down in the visitor's chair. "By the way, I saw Andrew in the parking lot. Was he doing something here?" Agatha froze for a split second, then sat down at her desk. "Huh? Andrew? I don't know. Maybe he was just passing through." "That's strange. He usually avoids the city center. Maybe he has business here." Frank studied his fiancée's face. Agatha avoided his gaze, her fingers nervously shuffling the papers on the table. Something was definitely wrong. "Agatha, are you okay?" "Of course. Why do you ask?" "You've been kind of tense lately, ever since we discussed the wedding details in February." "I'm just nervous. A wedding is a big event." They had lunch at the hotel restaurant, but the conversation didn't flow. Agatha was constantly distracted and didn't answer his questions several times. When Frank was about to leave, she didn't even walk him to the door, citing an urgent phone call. That evening at the Polar Star Bar, Frank shared his doubts with Stephen. "Maybe she's just nervous before the wedding," his friend suggested, wiping the glasses. "Women sometimes react that way to big changes." "I don't know, Steve. Something's wrong. And Andrew is acting strange, too." "How so?" "He's avoiding me. When we meet, he looks guilty. And today I saw him with Agatha." Stephen put down his glass and looked at his friend more closely. "With Agatha? Where?" "Near the hotel. They were talking at the service entrance." About what? I don't know. But it looked intimate. Stephen paused, then sat down across from Frank. Listen, buddy. Are you sure it's not just your paranoia? PTSD sometimes makes us see threats where there aren't any. Maybe. Frank finished his whiskey. But my intuition tells me something's going on. The next day, Frank decided to follow Agatha. He felt awful spying on his own fiancée, but his anxiety wouldn't let him rest. During his lunch break, he parked across the street from the hotel and waited. At 1 o'clock, Agatha left the building and got into her car. Frank followed her, keeping a safe distance. She didn't go to a restaurant, as he had expected, but to the outskirts of town, to an old sawmill that hadn't been in operation for several years. Frank parked behind the lumberyard and peeked out cautiously. Agatha got out of the car and waited. A few minutes later, Andrew's familiar pickup truck appeared. Her son got out of the car and walked toward Agatha. This time, they didn't stand at a distance. Andrew took her hands, then pulled her toward him. Agatha didn't resist. Frank felt his world crumbling around him, his fiancée and his son. How long had this been going on? How could he have been so blind? He watched them talk, watched Agatha cry, watched Andrew hold her. Every gesture, every touch was full of intimacy that never happens between strangers. Frank carefully returned to his car and drove away before they noticed him. His hands were shaking as he drove back to town. Fragments of thoughts swirled in his head. Betrayal, lies, humiliation. At the store, he could barely concentrate on his work. Bill asked him several times if he was okay, but Frank answered in monosyllables. "Why don't you go home early?" his boss suggested. "You don't look well." "No, I'm fine." But nothing was fine. The whole world he had so carefully built over the past 2 years was falling apart. Agatha, whom he loved, who was supposed to become his wife in 2 months, was cheating on him with his own son. That evening, Agatha came home later than usual. She looked tired and upset. "Bad day?" Frank asked, trying to keep his tone normal. "Yes, a lot of problems with suppliers." Another lie. Frank looked at her and tried to figure out when she had started lying to him. How long had he been living in a world of illusions? "Frank, you're looking at me strangely." "Just tired." At dinner, Agatha talked about her wedding plans, about finalizing the menu and ordering flowers. Every word about the wedding was a knife in Frank's heart. How could she talk about it, knowing she was cheating on him? "By the way, I was thinking of inviting Andrew to the food tasting next week. Maybe it will help you get closer." Frank almost choked on his food. "Why?" "Well, he's your son, and if he's going to be the best man, it would be nice to hear his opinion." "He hasn't agreed to be the best man yet." "Maybe he will if we show him how important he is to us." Frank looked at Agatha and thought she was mocking him. Or did she really naively believe that she could play the role of a loving bride while dating his son? That night, he lay awake, listening to Agatha's breathing. She slept restlessly, muttering something in her sleep. Several times he heard the name Andrew. The next morning, Frank made a decision. He had to know the truth, the whole truth. At the store, he waited until Bill went to the suppliers and called the construction company where Andrew worked. "Can I speak to Andrew Morrison?" "He's not here. He took the day off." "Did he work yesterday?" "No, he didn't. He said he had personal business." Frank hung up the phone. So Andrew had also taken the day off yesterday when he met with Agatha. How often did they see each other? How long had this been going on? At dinner that evening, he decided to check on Agatha. "I heard Andrew didn't work yesterday. Maybe he's sick." Agatha looked up from her plate. "How do you know?" "I called him at work. I wanted to invite him to lunch." "I don't know. Maybe he had something to do." "What kind of business?" "Frank, how should I know? I don't keep track of your son." But Frank saw the uncertainty in her eyes. She knew where Andrew was yesterday because she was with him. "Agatha, Can I ask you a direct question? She tensed up. Of course. Are you happy? What do you mean? Are you happy with me? Do you really want to get married? Agatha put down her fork. Frank, why are you asking? Because you've been acting strange lately. Distracted, nervous. Maybe you've changed your mind. I haven't changed my mind. Her voice sounded unconvincing. Then what's going on? Agatha got up from the table. Nothing's going on, just pre-wedding stress. She went into the bedroom, leaving Frank alone. He sat at the kitchen table, feeling the familiar rage building inside him. The same rage that had gripped him in Vietnam when he knew the enemy was somewhere nearby, but couldn't find him. Frank took a bottle of whiskey out of the drawer and poured himself a large glass. The alcohol burned his throat, but did not dull the pain. His fiancée and his son. The two most important people in his life had betrayed him. He remembered the words of his sergeant in Vietnam. Morrison, if you suspect you're surrounded, act fast. Hesitation kills. Frank finished his whiskey and went to the bedroom. Agatha was lying with her back to the wall. From the way she was breathing, he knew she wasn't asleep, but there was no conviction in her voice, only guilt. The April evening descended on Fairbanks like a gray blanket. Frank sat in his pickup truck in the parking lot near the Polar Star Bar, but didn't go inside. For the third day in a row, he had been following Agatha, trying to understand the extent of her deception. Each new discovery was a blow, but he had to know the whole truth. Today, Agatha said she would be at the hotel until 9 in the evening because of a meeting with suppliers. Frank checked. There were no meetings in her schedule. Susan at the front desk confirmed that Agatha had left at 6:30. Frank started the engine and drove to the old sawmill. His intuition told him that this was where he would find the answers to his questions. The abandoned sawmill stood 2 kilometers from the city, surrounded by tall pine trees. Once upon a time, it was bustling with life, employing hundreds of people, but the economic crisis of the 90s closed the enterprise for good. Now this place served as a secret refuge for lovers and informal meetings. Frank parked behind the old administration building and walked on foot. In the twilight, he spotted 2 cars near the main workshop, Agatha's silver Honda and Andrew's blue pickup truck. His heart was pounding, and blood was pulsing in his temples. Memories of Vietnam flooded back, ambushes, betrayal, the death of comrades. His hands began to shake from adrenaline and rage. Frank cautiously approached the workshop. Inside, a faint light from a flashlight or phone was shining. Through the broken window, he saw them. Agatha and Andrew were standing in each other's arms in the middle of the empty room. Their silhouettes merged into one in the dim light. Agatha was crying, and Andrew was stroking her hair, whispering something in her ear. Then his son kissed Frank's fiancée, long, desperately, the way people kiss those they fear losing. The world around Frank turned red. The blood pounded in his ears so loudly that it drowned out all other sounds. The rage that had been building up for weeks burst out with destructive force. He burst into the workshop without thinking about the consequences. Agatha and Andrew broke their embrace and turned to face him. In the light of the flashlight, Frank saw horror in their eyes. Not surprise, but horror. They knew their secret had been revealed. "Dad," Andrew began, taking a step forward. But Frank could no longer hear the words. Rage consumed him completely, turning him into an instrument of vengeance. 20 years ago in Vietnam, he had learned to kill quickly and efficiently. Those skills had not disappeared. Agatha tried to run away, but stumbled over an iron beam in the darkness. Frank caught up with her at the opposite wall of the workshop. His hands found her throat before his mind could stop them. Andrew was shouting something from behind, trying to pull his father away, but Frank was stronger and more experienced. Years of war had taught him to fight in any conditions. When it was over, Agatha lay motionless on the concrete floor. Andrew knelt over her, checking her pulse, but it was too late. Frank looked at his hands, unable to believe what had happened. His rage evaporated as quickly as it had appeared, leaving behind emptiness and horror at the realization of what he had done. "What have you done?" Andrew whispered, raising his head. Tears streamed down his face. "What have you done, Dad?" Frank turned and ran for the exit. Andrew shouted after him, but he didn't stop. He got in his car and drove away, not even knowing where he was going. Detective Maria Santos received a call at 10:30 p.m. 45 years on the Fairbanks police force had taught her not to be surprised by human cruelty, but this case promised to be special. The crime scene greeted her with the flashing lights of patrol cars and the glare of floodlights. The old sawmill had become a hub of activity: police, medics, forensic experts. Officer Jones approached her with a notebook in his hands. "What do we have?" Santos asked, pulling on rubber gloves. "A woman, 32 years old, Agatha Chen, administrator of the Northern Lights Hotel. Cause of death, strangulation. The body was discovered by Andrew Morrison around 9 o'clock in the evening, and he called the police." "Morrison? The victim's son?" "No, her fiancé. That is, her father's fiancé. It's a complicated family history." Santos entered the workshop where the experts were working. The body lay against the far wall, with signs of a struggle nearby. Overturned boxes, scuff marks on the concrete floor. "Where's the witness?" "In the patrol car. He's very upset and incoherent." The detective approached the car, where a young man of about 28 was sitting. Andrew Morrison looked devastated, his eyes red from crying, his clothes stained, his hands shaking. "Mr. Morrison, I'm Detective Santos. I need to ask you a few questions." Andrew looked up. "I already told the officer everything." "I understand, but I need details. What were you doing here tonight?" "We were meeting." "Meeting?" "Agatha and I. We had a relationship." Santos took out her notebook. "What kind of relationship?" "A romantic one. I know how it sounds. She was my father's fiancée, but something happened between us." "How long did it last?" "A few months. We tried to stop, but we couldn't." "Did anyone know about your relationship?" Andrew shook his head. "We kept it a secret. Only today." "What happened today?" "My father. He found us." Santos sensed a new twist in the case. "Your father was here?" "Yes. He burst into the workshop while we were talking. He was furious." "Where is he now?" "I don't know. He ran away after it happened." "Did you see your father kill Miss Chen?" Andrew covered his face with his hands. "I tried to stop him, but he was like a madman. He has PTSD. He's a Vietnam veteran. Sometimes he loses control." The detective wrote down Frank Morrison's address and passed the information on to the dispatcher. A few minutes later, 2 patrol crews were ordered to find and apprehend the suspect. Santos returned to the crime scene. The experts had already collected the main pieces of evidence: fabric fibers, fingerprints, shoe prints. A preliminary examination confirmed Andrew's words. The victim had been killed with bare hands by someone skilled in hand-to-hand combat. "Detective," Officer Jones called to her, "we found the suspect's car." Frank Morrison's pickup truck was parked near the Polar Star bar. The car was locked, but there was no one inside. The bar owner, Stephen Bradley, confirmed that he had seen Frank that evening, but he hadn't come inside, just sat in his car. "He looked upset," Bradley said. "I wanted to go over, but he drove away." "What time was that?" "Around 7, maybe a little later." The time matched Andrew's testimony. Santos realized that the case might be easier than it had initially seemed. A jealous fiancé, infidelity, murder in the heat of passion, a classic scenario. But experience told her that there were always hidden pitfalls in family matters. The search for Frank Morrison continued throughout the night. Detective Santos organized a search of all the places where the killer could be hiding: friends' houses, workplaces, abandoned buildings on the outskirts of Fairbanks. Patrol crews combed the city, but the veteran seemed to have vanished into thin air. At dawn, Santos received a call from Officer Jones. "Detective, we found him. Frank was sitting on a bench in a city park, 200 meters from the war memorial. He did not resist arrest, did not even raise his head when the police approached him. His clothes were torn and dirty, his face covered with abrasions. He had apparently spent the night in the woods. Frank didn't say a word during his arrest. He allowed himself to be handcuffed and taken to the station without resistance. In the interrogation room, Detective Santos sat down opposite the suspect. Frank looked devastated, his eyes red from a sleepless night. "Mr. Morrison, do you understand what you are accused of?" Frank nodded without looking up. "For the record, what happened last night at the old sawmill?" A long silence. Then, in a quiet, hoarse voice, "I killed Agatha." "Why?" "Because they betrayed me. She and my son." Santos turned on the tape recorder. "Tell me more." Frank finally looked up. There was no regret or anger in his eyes, only emptiness. "I'd suspected for weeks. Strange behavior, secret meetings. Yesterday I followed her and saw them together." "What did you feel at that moment?" "Rage. The same kind I felt in Vietnam when you realize you're surrounded by enemies." "Did you plan to kill Miss Chen?" "No, it just happened. When I saw them embracing, something inside me snapped." "Do you regret what you did?" Frank was silent for a long time. "I don't know. They destroyed my life before I destroyed theirs." Santos recorded the confession and handed the case over to the prosecutor. Frank was charged with second-degree murder. The court ruled that the crime was committed in the heat of passion, without prior planning. Andrew didn't leave the hospital for 3 days after that night. The shock and guilt drove him to a nervous breakdown. The doctors said it was post-traumatic stress and recommended long-term therapy. When he finally returned home, he found that news of the tragedy had spread throughout Fairbanks. The small town was abuzz with rumors, and the story of a veteran who killed his fiancée for cheating on him with his own son became the main topic of conversation. Andrew lost his job. The management of the construction company considered his presence undesirable after the scandal. Neighbors avoided him, and people pointed fingers at him in stores. Stephen Bradley closed the Polar Star bar for a week after Frank's arrest. When he reopened, the place was empty. No one wanted to be reminded of the tragedy. "I knew Frank for 20 years, he told the few customers. "The war broke him long ago, we just didn't notice." Frank Morrison's trial took place 4 months later. The defense tried to get him declared insane, citing PTSD and the defendant's emotional state. But a psychiatric evaluation showed that Frank was aware of his actions at the time of the crime. Andrew testified as a witness for the prosecution. He talked about his relationship with Agatha, how they hid it, and their last meeting at the sawmill. His voice trembled as he described how his father killed the woman they both loved. Frank listened to his son's testimony without emotion. Only when Andrew broke down in tears on the witness stand did something flicker in his father's eyes. The jury returned a guilty verdict after 2 hours of deliberation. The judge sentenced Frank Morrison to 15 years in prison with the right to parole after 10 years. Frank stood motionless as the sentence was read. He did not look at the courtroom where Andrew was sitting and did not say a word. Andrew left Fairbanks a month after the trial. He sold his house, packed his belongings, and moved to Anchorage, hoping to start a new life far from the scene of the tragedy. Before leaving, he visited Agatha's grave in the city cemetery. A simple gray monument with the inscription, "Agatha Chen, beloved daughter and friend." There was no mention of her engagement to Frank. The girl's relatives wanted to forget that part of her life. Andrew placed white roses, Agatha's favorite flowers, on the grave. "Forgive me," he whispered. "Forgive us both." In prison, Frank became a model inmate. He worked in the library, avoided conflicts, and participated in a program for veterans with PTSD. The psychologist noted his progress in coping with the trauma of war. But Frank never talked about what happened that April night. He didn't respond to letters from journalists and refused to meet with his former friends. Only once a year, on the anniversary of Agatha's death, would prison guards find him crying in his cell. Detective Santos was transferred to the Homicide Division after successfully closing the Morrison case. She often thought about this family, about how love and betrayal can destroy lives, how war continues to kill decades after it ends. In her file, the case was listed as solved, but Santos knew that none of the participants in that tragedy would ever be the same again. Fairbanks gradually forgot about the scandal. The Northern Lights Hotel changed managers, the Polar Star Bar was sold to a new owner, and the Northern Tool Hardware store hired a new salesperson. But the old sawmill remained abandoned. Local residents avoided the place, telling scary stories about the ghost of the murdered woman. Life went on, but the scars remained forever.